This is Module 41, Group Differences and the Question of Bias. Okay, so let's talk about some group differences in terms of sex on IQ scores. So overall, in general, men and women perform basically the same. There's really not much of a difference in overall IQ scores. It's in subscores where men and women tend to perform differently. So, for example, girls tend to outperform boys in spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, and sensitivity to touch, taste, and color. Boys tend to outperform girls in terms of spatial ability and on complex math problems. However, in just general math skills and math performance, boys and girls, there aren't much differences. The main places where we see a large difference in scores between males and females is in mental rotation tasks or kind of spatial tasks. So, this kind of task, for example, we tend to see that males tend to outperform females on these types of visual spatial rotation tasks. And the evolutionary perspective says that it's possible that men have more developed skills in that kind of task because this type of skill would have helped our, ancestral fathers track prey and then make their way home. On the other hand, females tend to have greater memory for objects and their locations. So, from the evolutionary perspective, women tended to be gatherers, and so it was important for women to have the memory of where items were that they could gather that were edible. Another interesting fact is that men tend to have more variability in scores than women, meaning there are more men that have very low scores on the IQ spectrum and very high scores, whereas females tend to be more clustered towards the mean, not as many low and super high scores. Now, evolutionary psychologists argue that biology affects our gender differences, such as they say that there are different life priorities that males and females have, there are different levels of risk taking and different math and spatial abilities, and that this is demonstrated cross culturally. Other psychologists say that there are culturally influenced preferences, so social elements that are affecting kind of these gender differences. And so, for example, in certain cultures, like, in the US, females tend to be more likely to avoid math heavy jobs than males, likely because of the culture that we are in. Research has found, though, that when people live in more gender equal cultures, there are less test differences in those countries like Sweden, Norway, than in cultures where there are great gender differences and not a lot of equality. All right, so ethnic similarities and differences on test scores. So there are many group differences in average intelligence test scores. So, for example, when looking at New Zealanders, people of European descent tend to outperform people of Maori, the native descent of New Zealand. Israeli Jews tend to outperform Israeli Arabs. And white Americans tend to outperform Black Americans on IQ scores. Now, we know that heredity does contribute to individual differences in intelligence. So, my intelligence compared to you as an individual, your intelligence, that can be due to genetics. But as a group, the variation is very, very little. And group differences in intelligence, they believe, are almost entirely environmental. So when we talk about racial differences, it's kind of hard to define because race is really a social construct. There isn't like super definitive lines of this person is this race and this person is this race. It's kind of more of a social construct than a biological one. So it's kind of hard to narrow down exactly who is categorized as what. But what research has found is that though there are differences, that in general white Americans tend to outperform black Americans just slightly. Like the average white American, it's like 100, and the average black American, it's about 95. And so, however, there is research that this could be due to environmental causes, not genetic causes. So, for example, the intelligence test of today, so today's individuals, we find that there is a much larger gap between, you know, a test taker today and a test taker in the 1930s versus a test taker today who is white and a test taker today who is black. There's such a small difference that it's almost negligible. But what research has also found is that when black Americans and white Americans have or receive the same knowledge, when they have or receive the same knowledge, they actually start to score the same. And so this could point to the fact that maybe there's being differences happening at the school level or in their communities. They're not getting the same knowledge. So school and culture matter. What we find is that when there are schools that have large wealth gaps, the kids who are the richest tend to score the highest, and the kids that are poorest tend to score the lowest. So that matters. Also, educational policies such as kindergarten attendance, school discipline, and instructional time per year can predict national differences in intelligence and knowledge tests, meaning the more time and money put into the educational system, the better the kids tend to perform. So if in communities of color, there isn't being money invested, this could be the reason why there is an underperformance, not because of some innate differences. Also, something to note is that, throughout our human history, there have been kind of these periods of genius or remarkable achievement in all different cultures. Each culture has kind of had their own time where they have, created these amazing achievements. So it's kind of silly to think that one group of people is more intelligent than another. And then also, test score differences may reflect the quality of education that different groups are receiving more so than any kind of inherent intelligence of any particular group. So, what they find is that in general, in some high school courses, Black and white American students are being treated differently, and so they're performing differently, versus at a college level they're being treated more similarly, and so black Americans tend to catch up or make up that lost ground or that gap during college when they're receiving the same level of treatment. Now, is the IQ test biased? Are tests biased? Well, there's two meanings of bias. First of all, there's a scientific meaning, which means that the test is not accurately predicting what it's supposed to predict. So, for example, if the SAT had predictive validity for women, it accurately predicted how women would perform, but did not accurately predict how men were performing in college, this would be a biased test in the scientific definition. What research has found is that in this meaning, the aptitude tests are not biased against any particular group, meaning that though there are differences, unfortunately, these differences are being reflected in the later performance of these individuals in school and these groups in school. However, there's another kind of meaning of bias, which means does the test detect performance differences caused by cultural experiences? So, for example, if the questions on an IQ test are culturally informed, and a person takes that test and they're not of that culture, they're likely to perform poorly because they don't have that cultural knowledge. That does not mean that they are unintelligent. It just means that they haven't received that same cultural knowledge. So, for example, if there was a test question and they said the cup goes with the blank, and some of us would say the cup goes with the saucer. But if you're from a community or a culture that doesn't use saucers, you might not be as likely to answer that question correctly. So that is one way that tests can be biased. And unfortunately, sometimes test makers can accidentally introduce bias into an intelligence test because they expect people to know this concept based on the culture that they live in. So for this reason, some test makers have suggested making cultural neutral or culture fair tests. And so some of them completely eliminate verbal assessments, but not all of them. Now, another way a test could be impacted is by the person taking the test, their expectations. So there is this concept called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So, for example, as a woman, there are negative stereotypes about women and driving. If, for example, I primed you and you were a female or a woman to think about being a woman and then taking a driving test, you are more likely to perform poorer because you are reminded of that stereotype, which could actually cause you to basically be stressed about that stereotype and accidentally maybe falling into that stereotype, that it could cause you to do so because it could impair your attention, it can impair performance, and it can impair learning. So we find this with lots of different groups. It affects white individuals, black individuals, Asian individuals, women, men. It affects everyone just in different ways. Now, there are ways that we could remove this threat by making it not so high stakes. We can remove the threat, which we see that when that happens, minority students tend to perform better. And also, self-affirmation can challenge this by just thinking about how you are, how you as an individual are good and capable and have potential. They find that those individuals who kind of think about that tend to do far better than those who do not. And I want you to ask yourself these two questions, answer those, and I will see you later. Bye.